All right, welcome back to Neural Intel. Today, we're tearing down Google's Gemini 3. And believe me, we're not just going to read you the press release. We're getting into the nitty-gritty, the architecture, the real-world performance, and most importantly, what it actually means for you, the people who are going to be building with this stuff. Let's dive in.
You know, our story today doesn't begin with some polished corporate blog post. It starts right here. This was the moment the dev community just knew something huge was on its way. The Gemini 3 Pro model card leaked, and this one Reddit comment, well, it pretty much captured the vibe of the entire community. It was real, and it set the stage for everything that came next.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down today. We'll start with the leak and the official launch. Then, we're going to do our neural signal check on the benchmarks to see if the reality matches the hype. After that, we'll get into the new agentic tools, unpack what this whole generative UI thing is all about, and finally get down to the brass tacks, the price of all this new power.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about what the community found in that leak, and then see how it stacks up against what Google officially came out and said.
So, what was in that leak? First off, a massive 1 million token context window right out of the gate, and you could even push that to 2 million through the Vertex API. Insane. Then you had a solid 64K token output length. The January 2025 knowledge cutoff, yeah, that made a lot of us scratch your heads. But one thing was crystal clear. This model was an absolute architectural beast.
But here's the thing. When Google finally made it official, their whole pitch was different. They weren't just talking specs. They were talking capability. They pushed Gemini 3 as this fundamental leap forward in the model's ability to actually reason, to understand subtlety and complexity. We're talking about a move way beyond just recognizing patterns.
All right, time for our first neural signal check. The big question is, right, do the numbers actually back up this claim of state-of-the-art reasoning? Let's take a look. So, do they back it up? Yeah. The numbers don't just support the claim, they basically shout it from the rooftops. I mean, look at humanity's last exam, a benchmark literally designed to stump PhDs, and Gemini 3 Pro is just blowing past the competition, and that's without tools. And look, this isn't a one-trick pony either. It's setting new records all over the place.
But out of all the numbers, this is the one that made us stop and really pay attention. 45.1%. That's the score Gemini 3 got in its deep think mode on a benchmark called ARC AGI-2. And what's special about that benchmark? It's all about solving problems the AI has never, ever seen before. This is where it gets really interesting.
So, what's our neural signal check on this? What does this actually mean? This isn't just about a bigger model. It points to a smarter one. This score suggests Gemini 3 is starting to show what psychologists call fluid intelligence, the ability to problem solve from scratch. And that's huge. Because for you, the developer, that means you're not just working with a giant autocomplete anymore. You're working with something that can actually reason its way through a problem it's never encountered.
Okay, so a model that can think. What does that actually let you do? Well, it signals a massive shift away from just building chatbots and towards building with truly autonomous AI agents.
And that brings us to Google Antigravity. Seriously, forget everything you know about code completion. This is not your dad's code assistant. Imagine an AI partner living inside your IDE with direct access to your editor, your terminal, and even a browser. You can give it a high-level goal like, hey, refactor this entire microservice for scalability, and it just goes and does it. Plans the whole thing, executes it, the whole shebang.
And the performance numbers? Yeah, they tell the story. A top score on Swebench? That's impressive, for sure. But the real headline here is the score on Terminal Bench 2.0. See, that test isn't about writing code in some safe little sandbox. It's about whether the AI can actually use a command line to get stuff done. And that, right there, is the make or break skill. This is what separates a cool tech demo from a tool you'd actually use.
Okay, now for something that's, well, it might be the wildest part of this whole release. We're talking about AI that doesn't just generate text or code, but builds entire user interfaces, completely on the fly.
Just think about this for a second. What if, instead of asking a question and getting a wall of text back, the AI could just generate a custom interactive web page to give you the answer? A little tool built just for you, right in that moment. That, right there, is the promise of generative UI.
And look, this isn't some black magic, right? It's just really, really clever engineering. You can think of it like an assembly line. First, the model gets access to a bunch of tools, like image generation or web search.
Then it gets a super detailed set of instructions on how to plan and build the UI, and finally, its raw output gets cleaned up by a post-processor to handle common glitches. For anyone building with this, that pipeline is what turns a cool idea into a feature you can actually ship.
Okay, performance is amazing. The new tools are incredible. But let's get down to it. For anyone trying to deploy this in a real enterprise setting, there's only one question that matters. What's the bill going to look like?
So let's just look at the standard tier pricing, head-to-head. For every million tokens you feed in, Gemini 3 Pro is going to cost you $2, up from $1.25 for the last version. Output costs see a similar bump from $10 to $12. So yeah, you're definitely paying a premium for these new capabilities.
But here's where it gets really tricky. Look at that chart. You see that massive 6 times cost multiplier for output versus input? Here's the kicker. That $12 output cost now officially includes thinking tokens. That's the compute the AI uses for planning and using tools. In other words, the more your agent thinks, the more you pay.
Right, so managing that cost becomes absolutely critical. So if you're deploying this at scale, you've got to be strategic. You have to use things like the Batch API to cut costs in half for jobs that aren't time-sensitive. You need to watch that 200,000 token cliff where your price literally doubles, and you'll have to do the math on whether the new context caching feature actually saves you money for your specific workflow.
Okay, let's pull back a bit and wrap this up. What's the big picture here? Where is all this heading?
If you look at the timeline of the Gemini models, you can see a really clear story unfolding. With Gemini 1, it was all about building models that could understand huge amounts of complex data, images, text, audio, all of it. Gemini 2 started laying the groundwork for those models to actually act on that understanding. And now, with Gemini 3, it's all about making that action smarter, more reliable, and a whole lot more autonomous.
Which brings us to a final, and honestly, kind of provocative thought. As these platforms like Antigravity get better and better, the day-to-day job of a software developer could change in a huge way. Is the most valuable skill for a developer no longer going to be writing line-by-line code, but instead designing, prompting, and orchestrating these complex systems of AI agents? It's a question I think every technical team needs to be asking right now.
And that's our deep dive on Gemini 3. If you want to keep the conversation going and stay on top of everything happening in AI, you know where to find us, neuralintel.org. Thanks for tuning in.